As is often the case with our cartographic explorations, this episode begins with an artifact. Discovered in 1977 or 78, my sources are a bit unclear on this, the untitled object is an engraving on a bronze plate that likely dates to sometime near the end of the 4th century BCE, perhaps right around 310 or so. The engraving represents a top-down view of a walled area, with what are 5 sacrifice halls arranged in a line down the center. These are surrounded by a rectangular inner wall with 4 smaller buildings right up along one of the long sides of it, and this in turn is enclosed by a second outer wall. The lines of the figure that delineate these structures are inlaid into the bronze and are made of gold and silver, creating an exquisite work of geometrical art. One that includes, on its surface, numerous characters taken from the Chinese written language. These graphs, as they are commonly known, tell the reader much about the artifact, its creation and creator, its purpose, what it represents, and the dimensions over which it is to be laid out. From these graphs, we know that the engraving represents the funerary site for one King Kuo, ruler of the Zhongxi kingdom, a smallish political state found in northern China during a time historians call the Warring States period. Dating from about 485 BCE to 286 BCE, this is one of those few eras when no single political entity and associated dynasty could lay claim to controlling a large region that could be identified as China. Hence, Kuo would call himself king over a relatively modest but still sizable enough chunk of territory that he could order the construction of the site represented on the bronze plate. Known by scholars as the Zhao Tu, which in essence means map or plan of the mausoleum, this particular artifact may be the oldest known map from China. Moreover, since some of the characters scribed into the bronze give the dimensions to which the mausoleum should be built, this is, in fact, the oldest piece of cartographic information that has numerical writing on it found anywhere in the world. I say may, however, because, well, there's more to the story. The artifact was found in the tomb of our king, but the actual site the engraving depicts only has 2 of the 5 indicated interior sacrifice buildings or tomb, wherein the earthly remains of the deceased were to have rested. While the 2 tombs, one for Kuo and the other for his wife Ai, clearly conform to the dimensions given on the engraving, as do the walls of the site, the remainder of the structures indicated are nowhere to be found. The other 3 interior buildings were to have been constructed for Kuo's second wife and or concubine, and 2 other unnamed personages, but it seems that they were never built. Nor were the 4 smaller buildings that were to have nestled up to the outer side of that inner wall. You see, it turns out that while King Kuo may have had dynastic ambitions for his lineage, and honestly, what royal line doesn't, his neighbors seem to have had other ideas. Sometime after his death, Zhongxi seems to have fallen prey to another of the warring states, and his descendants, or whomever were to have laid in eternal rest with him, did not have the honor of doing so. Their tombs were never constructed. In this story, then, we find a source of the ambiguity of what to actually call this artifact. It doesn't actually describe an actually finished thing. It's more of a plan of a site to become than a place that is. An ancient blueprint of a public works project yet to be begun that was actually never finished. From the text, we know that Kuo ordered that 2 copies of the engraving be made, one to be kept in the public archives of his kingdom, and the other to be buried with him in his yet-to-be-constructed tomb. Hence the name given to the engraving, the Zhao Tu, specifically what we would say in that last word, or graph, 2. That's the thing that is the source of our ambiguity. Much as is the case in many other languages where cartographic activities arise out of the ancient practice of drawing to represent spatial relationships, the word here is multifaceted in its potential meanings. Perhaps, as I've said, even ambiguous. In early instances of Chinese writing, the graph's meaning can encompass many things: pictures, diagrams, charts, tables, as well as maps on a variety of different materials. As you might have guessed, almost all of these are associated with the idea of organizing information in a visual way, though it should be noted that in time such information will be deeply coupled with textual sources as well. By the time of this engraving, however, those seem to have been narrowed down to the point where the graph, too, was used mostly to refer to either maps or plans, either in pictorial or textual contexts. This leads one to begin asking a few interesting questions. Was the engraving a map or a plan? Is that distinction one that's even important in the culture of the time? Is it a distinction that then later becomes important for the culture? Is that distinction important in the culture now? The answers to such questions may tell us a lot about how cartographic activity was viewed by those who engaged in it and what purpose it served in the culture, something that certainly varies from place to place and from time to time. From our modern Western perspective, such things often seem to have clearer answers. A plan and a map are different things. Plans can have maps, physical things that show or represent spatial relationships, but they aren't actually physical things. Plans are ideas, aspirations, intentions, often with accompanying representations, but they are unrealized. But this stems from a Western cultural heritage rooted, perhaps, in Aristotle's rational causes. What if your culture doesn't have such organizing principles when attempting to understand the nature of the physical universe? Could then maps and plans be much closer things? In this episode of the Scientific Odyssey, our journey takes us east, though only if you're centering your worldview on the Mediterranean Ocean and either Hellenistic or Greco-Roman cultures that surrounded it. As we know, on a globe, one could just as easily travel west, as one Phoenician navigator would argue in the court of the King and Queen of the Spains, some 1800 years after King Quo approved the layout of what would be his final resting place. In our journey today, we'll need to leave behind some perhaps loosely held ideas or preconceptions in order to understand the nature and role of cartography in ancient China. However, in doing so, we may find that we gain valuable insight into our understanding of cartography in the human experience. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 5, Finding Our Way. Episode 12, Boundaries of Empire. So, for a time, we're going to sail away from the waters of that Middle Ocean and explore other cultures that are at about the same time, either in their development or by actually being contemporaneous, and who were also engaging in the activities of representing space in some combination of graphical and textual form. In doing this, let us recall a few things that will help us move past some of the preliminaries. First, remember, people are people. Generally, they're motivated by the same sorts of things, at least early on. And when we find similar artifacts between different cultures, it's probably wise to assume that the artifacts serve similar purposes across cultures unless there is some compelling evidence to suggest otherwise. Second, remember that the pre-civilizational level is generally going to last a lot longer than the period of time after which civilization arises. In other words, folks are around doing stuff for a long time before they domesticate plants and animals and decide to settle down in this place or that. Third, the things people need to do to survive are pretty similar within a climate and perhaps across climates. They need to be able to have a rudimentary way to track time, conceptualize space, and then communicate that information to others for the good of the band or tribe. And that's going to be sort of a ubiquitous thing. Everybody's basically got to do that. While the specifics may vary from place to place, the foundations are going to remain the same by and large. All of this is to say that pretty much everything we said about prehistoric, artistic / cartographic activity and the artifacts that were found in Europe and the Near East is true when you go to the Far East. When archaeologists go looking for things like cave paintings or rock etchings or things like that, they find them in similar places with similar themes. Teasing out what is cartographic in nature from what is artistic in nature is just as difficult and perplexing. Yet, what is wonderful is that these sorts of things and the kinds of things that we saw in the mountains of Italy or Spain or wherever are also found several places in Asia as well. Again, people are people. We humans really like expressing our experience of the world through drawing and painting and scratching it into and onto the rocks. With that having been said, let's see if we can move into some sort of historical or at least mytho-historical context when it comes to cartography in Asia. And one short final note here. When I refer to Asia, I'm really using that term in a broadly cultural context that seems to be agreed upon these days. Geographically, referring to the part of the world we're going to be talking about as Asia or East Asia or the Far East is, well, a pretty recent development. Students of classical history, I should say, will know that these cultures actually refer to anything on the eastern side of the Mediterranean and going sort of east from there. All of that was just called Asia. You know, if you've studied your Roman history, you know that the Romans called the province associated with what we think of as modern Turkey now, Asia Minor. For reasons we'll get into later, those who lived at the more eastern end of the Eurasian continent didn't see themselves so much as a geographical entity, but instead more as a cultural one. Moreover, the cultures of the region we'll refer to as East Asia, comprising of China, Korea, Japan, and to lesser extents Vietnam, the Manchu region, and Mongolia, represent a culture centered on that of China, but not always dominated by it. Without question, Chinese culture is the touchstone of the region, but each of those states or peoples around what we think of as China interacted with it in a culturally dynamic way, sometimes borrowing from it, sometimes appropriating, sometimes blending, sometimes just outright rejecting. As Nathan Sivan and Gary Ledyard write, quote, East Asia is useful mainly as a cultural label. We mean by it the parts of Asia that were governed by a system based more or less on the bureaucratic, hereditary monarchy of China. The connection was more than political. In these countries, the elite before this century generally were educated in Chinese classics and literature, wrote in classical Chinese, and were exposed to Neo-Confucianism. End quote. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is begin by focusing on China, sort of that region between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, at least to begin with, because that's sort of the cultural center of the region. China, in one form or another, will often dominate its neighbors, and so they would inevitably, pick up some of its practices and standards in a number of areas. As we move on, we'll sort of look at the unique qualities in some of the practices in those areas that were able to establish independent cartographic traditions. Also, our approach for this will be to begin with the origins of the Chinese cartographic tradition in its ancient history and then develop things from there. Initially, this will consist of something of a timeline-based approach, but once we establish the broad outlines of that timeline, we're going to focus on the role cartography played in various aspects of Chinese culture, as that I think will offer us better insight. This is the approach taken by Dr. Cordell Yi in his work in the history of cartography, and I see much to recommend it here for our explorations. While the timeline-based view gives us a sort of clear narrative thread in the sense that, this person did that, which influenced this other person who in turn developed this idea further, it also creates a sort of falsely linear perspective towards the development of map-making in China that is not well supported by the evidence. In a sense, what we really have going on with that is that we're really imposing a Western time and cultural paradigm where it probably doesn't always belong. So to alleviate this, we'll look at the role map-making played in various cultural areas such as politics, scientific activity, and humanistic endeavors as our main focus. So, as we set out here, let's make a few more comments about the language associated with cartography here, because it turns out that this is going to be pretty important for understanding what's going on in the Chinese cartographic tradition. As I mentioned in the episode's opening, the graph 2 is one that is perplexing to us today. When studying archaic Chinese writing, it's helpful to know that there was, for many centuries, sort of a linguistic ethos that one graph or character should represent one single word. What's great about this from a linguistic perspective is that it allows the writer to pack an enormous amount of information into a very short sentence. The problem with this is that unless you want to have an incredibly large number of individual graphs, you need to have your graphs be able to mean more than one thing. So how do you tell which meaning should be used? Well, context. You can infer which meaning is the correct one by looking at the context of the larger phrase or sentence or even document. Chinese writers were, by and large, exceptionally good at writing in such a way that the context was clear to their readers, and so the meaning of the word was also clear. This is great, except for one other thing. Context is dependent on both the writer and the reader sharing a certain amount of cultural information. Cultural information we don't have hundreds or thousands of years after documents were written. For example, let's say that in, 300 BCE, during the Warring States period, it was common practice for a certain type of document being produced for bureaucratic use to have had a regional map associated with it. And here, by the way, I'm using map in the very traditional modern sense. A writer in that bureaucracy would have assumed that anyone reading his description of something would have known that, and so the use of the graph 2 would have been clear to both the writer and the audience. We, however, don't have that cultural context, so we don't know if the written text document that has that graph 2 in it might refer to a map, or a plan, or a table of figures, or some combination of those things and other text. This means we either have to try to do some cross-referencing between various sources, or we have to look at later practice and see if it's reasonable that we could sort of think of that later practice as a continuation of an earlier way of doing things. The former approach is hampered because we just don't have that much to go on. There aren't a lot of maps from before about 1000 CE. This means that we must rely on the second approach, which, for a culture as conservative as China was and is, may not actually be too bad of a guide. If so, then the words of the 12th century scholar Zheng Cao are of great value here. In discussing recording and transmission of cartographic information, he makes a comparison to the weaving of a tapestry. He writes, quote, "Images, too, are the warp threads, and the written words, shu, are the weft. To see the writing without the image is like hearing the voices without seeing the form. To see the image without the writing is like seeing a person without hearing the words." End quote. There are two things I think that we can take from this quote that can inform our broader understanding of cartographic activity in East Asia. First, note the wonderful word play between the words tu and shu that gives this distinct impression of a profoundly dynamic process. One I think is appropriate for many early mapping and planning activities. In English, the words map and plan can act both as nouns and verbs depending on their use. A surveyor can go out and map, do a thing, a piece of property, and that activity will produce an artifact that the owner of that property can hold in their hands. A noun, a map, a thing. A city planner can go through a process of gathering information and data, getting public input, doing budgeting in a process that's called planning that will result in a document that might thenceforth be called quote-unquote the plan. The actions and the things are intimately tied together in this usage, and I think that's super, super important for how the Chinese conceive of their cartographic activity, in the fact that you have the same sort of dynamism in the interplay between the graphical elements and the textual elements. And that's the second and really important part that shows up here. And I think this is really fairly specific to Chinese cartography, as we'll see. While the Chinese aren't the only culture to do this, you see it in Roman cadastral surveying, they do it more often and more completely than anybody in Europe will. And that is this close tie between the graphical and textual information that we've mentioned. If you think about this, contrast this with sort of modern cartographic practice, where usually when you think about a map, you get a map, you pull it up in Google, you're using Google Maps, or you bring it up on your phone or whatever. What you're given is a graphical representation of a region. And usually you only have a minimal amount of sort of clarifying information on that graphical representation, perhaps a scale or maybe a key of symbols to represent various things on the map. That's the really modern way we think of mapping. But when we look at the Chinese tradition up until about the 19th century, when European practices are sort of introduced and or sort of imposed on them, you just don't see that kind of form of mapping. In Chinese cartography, the idea of the graphical image standing alone is pretty much unheard of. There's always text associated with the graphical image to help the user or reader of the cartographic document understand what is being represented graphically and, as we'll talk about in a later episode, tie all of that information to earlier information that has been gathered by previous scholars or cartographers. What I hope this brief digression helps you, the listener, do is broaden out what you might think of as what constitutes a map in this East Asian cultural setting. You probably want to set aside that static, fully graphical, quantitative, information-dense sheet of paper that you call to mind when someone says map, and allow for a broader variety of traditions and forms of expression. At this point, I think to move forward, we need to go back, at least chronologically. And if we were to jump into the Wayback Machine to find the earliest references of what might be thought of as geographical or cartographical thinking in the Chinese historical record, we would go to a document known as the Yu Gong, or Tribute of Yu. It's probably hard to overstate just how foundational this chapter of a larger compilation of works known as the Book of Documents is in Chinese culture and historical thought. The Book of Documents was pulled together sometime around the Warring States period between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. It describes the life and actions of one of China's legendary, perhaps even mythical, figures known as Yu the Great. For a Western analog that perhaps you students of all things Roman might sort of relate to, Yu could perhaps be thought of as Romulus, maybe. A kind of a great figure, possibly a real person who may have done some really great things, but has been assigned even more amazing feats and accomplishments that sort of attain truly epic proportions. Yu was the founder of one of China's earliest dynasties, that of the Zhai, around 2000 BCE. To do this, he is said to have created an orderly world by taming the flooding Yellow and Yangtze rivers through creating better farming practices and implementing a series of public works projects directed towards flood control. As the book retells, quote, "You disposed the lands in order. Going among the mountains, he put forests to use, felling trees. He determined the high mountains and the great rivers." End quote. In this quote, we see what may be the key cultural imperative for a ruler in ancient China. As the producer of the excellent History of China podcast, Chris Stewart, related to me in a conversation, quote, "Ancient Chinese rulers, and especially those accounts that come to us in the aftermath of the Warring States period, which is pretty much all of them, are centered around the concept that it's absolutely imperative that order must be hewn from chaos. That's the central function of the state and its personification in the emperor." End quote. I love that phrase, order must be hewn from chaos, because I think that captures the heart of what we're going to say about Yu and his ongoing influence when it comes to the geographic and cosmological influence on cartography and its role in Chinese culture. As a part of this disposing the lands to order, Yu is said to have divided the territory between the two great rivers into 9 provinces, or palaces, in a roughly 3x3 grid, each square in the grid being 1,000 li on a side. For those used to Western units, that's about 400 kilometers or 250 miles on each side for an area roughly the size of the state of Iowa, or, if you're in, Europe, the countries of Austria and the Czech Republic put together. This Nonneri Square, as it is often referred to, Nonneri from the word for the number 9, because there are 9 squares on the grid, is known as the figure of 9, and it will become as ubiquitous in Chinese culture as the number 7 has become in the West. The word 9, zhou, is closely related to the word for everlasting or long-lasting. In East Asian culture, there are 9 fields of heaven, 9 avenues of capital, 9 divisions of the human body, 9 wells in the realm of the dead, 9 branches of the Yellow River. There are 9 spikes placed above and or around the gates of various cities, and architectural measurements of public buildings are often based around 9 units of length. Administrative rank in the bureaucracy was based on 9 levels, and the emperor had 9 bestowments he could grant on those who were found to display exceptional talent in service to the state. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. 9 is a really big deal because that's how you ordered China. Additionally, just as the Greeks will elevate the circle to the level of philosophical idea, so too the Chinese will do the same with this Nonneri Square. Hence, in China, it will be a geographical rather than a cosmological view that will organize their worldview. Or perhaps a better way to say it is that in many ways, the geographic will be their cosmological worldview. Where this organizing principle came from is sort of lost to the mists of time, as is often the case in these sort of things. Though some have suggested it's derived from the pattern found on the carapace of a turtle, while others look to the less fanciful suggestion that the large, flat plains of the northern part of China lead one to such a view of the world. One addition, however, that should be mentioned is that, like the Greeks had done, the Yugong also divides the world up into quote-unquote zones. These zones, however, are rather different than the latitude-based conceptions of Aristotle and his peers. Yu zones are really concentric frames around the central one, that Nonneri Square of original provinces, that are based on the 4 cardinal wind directions. In the center lies civilization, which of course corresponds to the royal lands. Each frame outwards leads into greater levels of barbarism. First there are the tributary vassal states, then the vast, wild, sparsely populated marches, and then outside of that one finds the allied barbarians, and then finally the zone of cultureless, savage people. By the way, those people include Europe. Why is this so important? Well, this geographical worldview, or perhaps cosmology, though I hesitate to use the word for reasons I'll explain in a little bit, is something that is taken and used to create structure on a social level in terms of organization, administration, and policy. One example of this is what's known as the well-field system of land division and cultivation. A group of 8 families would be assigned 8 plots of land, one each, that corresponded with the outer 8 grid spaces of the divided Nonneri Square. That 9th central square was held collectively by the families and was used as they saw fit, creating social bonds that tied the families deeply to each other and to the land. As the Confucian scholar Mencius wrote in the 4th century BCE, quote, "Benevolent government must start with demarcating boundaries. Violent rulers are always sloppy with the demarcation of boundaries. Once the boundaries are correctly demarcated, then the division of fields and the regulation of salaries can be fixed without exertion." End quote. In other words, if a king or emperor wanted to rule effectively, the place to start was the ninefold division. Anything else would lead to strife, conflict, and inevitably violence. It's pretty remarkable to think that in Chinese culture, the foundation of orderly rule was the orderly division of land, a politics of geography. To contrast this with the West, you can't really imagine Machiavelli or Hobbes saying something like this, I think. Or to go further back to a contemporary society, having Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics say that the key to being a successful ruler was to make sure the land was divided up in a specific way and then parceled out in an orderly fashion, just doesn't seem like something that they would really say. They might talk about, virtue or something else like that. But again, the role of the emperor, the role of the ruler, is to cue order out of chaos. And you do that by creating an orderly division of the lands. The Romans sort of put something like this into practice when they create the cadastral maps for their military colonies around the Mediterranean, but I don't think any of the Caesars thought that this was the key to their rule. And I think that this concept illustrates, what I think is a key idea I want to make in this episode. Here in the United States, there's this proverbial statement that really is pretty true in a lot of cases. At least I think it is. Good fences make good neighbors. I think the Chinese leadership of the early period would really have liked that idea. The role of well-established boundaries is, in many ways, I think, central to how the Chinese leaders and rulers of the period leading up to the Warring States period saw their role. And this would carry over through that period as both an aspiration and then a set of policy objectives once the Qin dynasty begins to assert authority over the many small and fractured states that had been vying for control of what had been seen as the once great empire prior to that Warring States period. By the way, for those who are interested in learning more about the political aspect of this period of Chinese history, might I recommend the aforementioned History of China podcast. Mr. Stewart does a great job of laying out the history of China in a way that is clear and understandable. And if you sort of want to find out kind of how all of this stuff works, his early episodes do a fantastic job of that. To get a better sense of this intertwining of the geographic and the cosmologic, let's take a look at something we talked about pretty extensively when we looked at the Mesopotamian and Greek cartographies. The idea of creating maps of the world, or what are often known as mapimundi in Latin, or pereidos, or circuits of the earth in Greek. These classical Western cultures have creation mythologies that involve the earth and the rest of the cosmos being formed by some sort of divine will. And so, to know the extent of the earth and its peoples is to know something about the divine being that created it. In contrast, there isn't really a good analog to this in Chinese cultural mythology. Instead of there being these really, incredible divine gods or being, there are these mythical rulers who set out boundaries of the kingdom and empire in order to establish that orderly kingdom. With no creation as a divine act of expressed will, there's really no cultural imperative to create a picture of all of the earth. And this will have two different consequences. The first has to do with the development of cosmological pictures of the nature and structure of the universe in early China. While there's a lot of diversity of thought in this area, the three main views of the cosmos that emerge over time are as follows. The earliest is best visualized by thinking of a hemispherical sort of bamboo hat being laid upon the square of the earth. The corners of the square earth, divided up in checkerboard fashion of course, slope downward at the four corners to sort of blend into a surrounding ocean. And this is known as the Kai Tian theory. More popular than this was the Huntian theory, which proposed an enveloping heavens that encircle the earth. In this view, the picture might be something like what was proposed by one writer, Zhongxi, who said that, quote, "The heavens are like a hen's egg, and as round as a crossbow bullet. The earth is like the yolk of the egg, and lies alone in the center." End quote. Here we see a picture that is not all that dissimilar to the Hellenistic picture of a spherically oriented cosmology with a spherical earth. Finally, there is the Zhongxi Shul, or infinite space theory. In this, the heavens are truly an empty void, with the earth, sun, and moon floating freely within it. All three of these ideas will be held throughout the history of Chinese intellectual thought, but by the 6th century CE, the Huntian theory seems to become the most dominant, though there is a fair bit of variation as to what the shape of the earth would be, whether it was a flat square or a disk, or whether it was a sphere. What's interesting for our discussion is that there is a 3rd century document, I should say 3rd century BCE, that we know of that's mathematical in nature that asserts, quote, "heaven in round, earth in square," end quote. And it reflects this pervading influence of that Nonneri Square view beyond just land division and administration into the view of the cosmos itself. And this, I think, is where maybe I can pull some of our disparate threads of this episode together to form a more coherent tapestry. For the peoples of East Asia, there was really one great, overarching cultural reality, and that was the existence from a time reaching back beyond memory and written record of a central political entity thought to be organized, if you'll pardon the contradictory pun here, around the idea of a well-ordered square grid. Unlike cultures of the West, which took in a diverse set of traditions from around the Middle Ocean, the Mediterranean, there was only one cultural or central cultural reality, and that was broadly writ China. This cultural entity would be characterized by long, relatively stable dynasties that ruled over large areas, with a level of bureaucratic efficiency that would have been the envy of many of the Western empires that were contemporary with it. Moreover, unlike the Western religious traditions that would arise a little later, namely Christianity and Islam, that had built into their faiths an imperative to go out to the world and spread the word, as it were, the Chinese spiritual traditions were directed more inwardly, centered on home and hearth. Finally, and this is an idea I put forward in our episode on Chinese astronomy a while back, Chinese astronomical focus tended to be aligned more closely with the circumpolar stars, those patterns in the sky that did not change in the way the constellations along the ecliptic did, with the varying rising and setting times and the motions of the planets through them. Combined with an ancestor worship that claimed that the departed resided among those circumpolar regions in the sky, the unchanging mandate of heaven tended to produce political dynasties that changed very little, and often only when extraordinary alignments of the planets took place, signaling a conference of sorts. In terms of what this meant for mapping, I think Jerry Broughton summarizes it well in his book, 12 Maps That Changed the World. He writes, quote, "The result was a tradition of map-making that focused on the establishment of boundaries and practiced maintenance of empire, concerns produced by bureaucratic elites much earlier than in the religious societies of the West. It did not try to project an imaginative geography beyond its borders that could be claimed on behalf of a particular religion or ideology." End quote. Therefore, as we will see in the episodes that follow this one, it is this need to establish and maintain proper boundaries, along with continued reverence for the past, that will motivate much of Chinese cartographic activity. Adding to this will be a very different set of cartographic values, namely the role of textual information we mentioned earlier and the close integration of artistic and aesthetic elements alongside those representational and quantitative elements we've discussed in previous episodes. These factors will lead to a cartographic tradition that, while it will share some aspects with those of its contemporary societies in the West, will also be very unique in its multifaceted development. And so, as we close, perhaps we should return to King Kuo's mausoleum engraving and see if we can glean anything else from it based on what we've learned. First, within its design, we see the idea of 9 realized in the number of structures, 5 sacrifice halls, and then 4 outer buildings. With the 2 sets of walls, we see a reflection of an inner and an outer, along with a strong sense of boundaries between the various regions of the larger complex. Second, with the text integrated into the engraving, we have an example of the warp and weft of the two complementary aspects that make up the whole, the graphical and the textual. Third, we see the inherent ambiguity in the graph too. There are those, based on how the graph is drawn, who suggest that the correct way to translate it, especially during this earliest period, is as difficulty in planning, something the story of our king and his star-crossed kingdom would certainly attest to. More than that, however, what we see is a dynamism in the act of preparing a plan. As Broughton says in 12 Maps, quote, "Unlike the pine axe of the early Greeks, the Chinese too is a dynamic act rather than a physical medium, as recent sinologists have argued by defining it as, quote, template for action," end quote. And I think this is a good place for us to leave off this episode. 2 as a template for action. As I was re-listening to the previous episode of the show today, I realized that I used a phrase that perhaps encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about over the course of this series and what we will be talking about in some of the episodes to come. The phrase is drawn together, as in, the people of the empire were drawn together by the shared cultural experience of seeing the entire empire represented on a map. Now, this is, of course, a sort of metaphorical statement, or at least that's how I intended to use it. But as I heard it, I realized just how appropriate it is, or could be, for what we've been exploring these last many episodes. When we talk about 2 people being drawn together by, something, we're really sort of talking about some kind of, mutual attraction. It's sort of a Newtonian idea of attractive forces. But to be honest with you, I'm not sure that was what the original meaning of the phrase actually was. To me, I think the expression may have had to do something with the idea of 2 people or 2 things being drawn together, literally drawn together in the same sketch or painting or other work of art. So too in mapping. When 2 peoples are drawn together, perhaps this is a reference to the 2 lands in which they live being represented on a map. In an imperial setting, say the Roman Empire for example, I imagine that it may have been hard for the people of Hispania to see themselves as having anything in common with the peoples of Asia Minor. They're thousands of miles apart and are culturally pretty distinct. And yet, for a merchant or a legionary, it seems to me that seeing both places shown relative to each other, i.e. drawn together, on a map would have been a powerful unifier. The two regions being drawn together on the map literally drew them together in the metaphorical attractive force sense. Perhaps somebody who does such philosophical investigations might be able to do a bit of research on this topic and let us know if we're on the right track. And by the way, that's a not-so-veiled hint to the folks at the Endless Knot podcast, which, by the way, is another fantastic show if you like that kind of thing. Anyways, as we wrap up, as always, thanks for taking the time to tune in spite of our lengthy breaks. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Today, as I write this, we're snowbound here on the edge of the Colorado Plateau with the much-needed precipitation generated by a low-pressure system off the Pacific that is targeting the region just east of the Front Range of the Rockies. For the crew members in Denver, Cheyenne, Laramie, Goodland, and Colby, be safe and pass the time indoors by listening to this episode and perhaps a few others. We've made a couple of recommendations you might enjoy. The solstice episode of our own seems particularly relevant at the moment, to be honest. Also, if you get a chance, check out the website of our musical hosts, the Blue Dot Sessions. They make some really fantastic music, and we're very fortunate to be able to have them along for our journey. Also, we're slowly getting episodes over onto our platform at YouTube. It's a laborious and surprisingly difficult process, but we're getting there. If you or someone you know like to partake of your media through that platform, please head on over and check us out. Subscribe and give us a thumbs up, as I'm sure that helps us move up in the various search engines. You can find us out on YouTube by just searching on The Scientific Odyssey. If you listen to us on a podcasting service of some other sort and have a few minutes, we'd love to have you leave us a review there as well. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't once again acknowledge and say thanks to Chris Stewart for taking the time to chat with me a bit about the key idea of order from chaos. Finally, for many of us, there is a light here at the end of the year-long tunnel. As the various vaccines for the coronavirus come out and become more available, one of the things we have to worry about is it becomes easy to move too quickly. Remember to follow the guidelines of your relevant public health agencies and be safe. It's been a really long year for everyone. You know, as one movie character noted, it's been like Eugene O'Neill long, right? But a few more weeks or maybe months are doable in order to protect yourselves and those around you. When a vaccine becomes available for you, be sure to get it. And as always, look out for each other and your neighbors. There's been a great deal of tragedy and grief, but there's been just as much resilience and grit to overcome the difficulties and obstacles. If we remain diligent, we will soon be able to raise a glass together, remember those we have lost, and celebrate the days to come. Until next time, full sails on your journey.